Medieval Europe was a world held together as much by fear as by faith, and in that fragile balance rumours did not merely spread. They condemned, destroyed, and erased innocent lives with terrifying efficiency, because in an age without scientific understanding, mass literacy, or reliable communication, explanation came not from evidence but from suspicion, authority, and collective panic. When disease struck, crops failed, or social order trembled, people searched desperately for someone to blame, and rumours provided answers that felt emotionally satisfying even when they were utterly false, allowing communities to project their dread onto outsiders, neighbours, or the powerless, transforming whispered stories into lethal certainties. One of the most devastating rumours was the belief that certain groups deliberately poisoned wells to cause sickness, a story that surged repeatedly during plague outbreaks, particularly during the 14th century, when the terror of sudden death made rational thought collapse. Accusations often targeted Jewish communities, whose distinct customs, languages, and relative social isolation made them appear suspicious to Christian majorities, and once the rumour took root that Jews had conspired with the devil to destroy Christendom by poisoning water sources, it spread faster than the disease itself, leading to mass arrests, forced confessions under torture, expulsions, and horrific executions, including burnings and massacres that wiped out entire communities who had lived peacefully for generations. These accusations required no proof, because fear itself was treated as evidence, and local authorities, eager to show control or deflect blame from their own failures, often endorsed the rumours rather than challenging them. Equally destructive were blood libel accusations, grotesque myths claiming that Jews kidnapped and murdered Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals, a belief entirely fabricated, yet repeatedly revived whenever a child went missing or died under unclear CNR circumstances. Once such a rumour surfaced, it unleashed mob violence, legal persecution, and long-lasting stigma, with entire families tortured until they confessed to crimes that never occurred, demonstrating how a single whispered story could outweigh centuries of coexistence. Rumours were not limited to religious minorities. They also consumed women with particular ferocity, especially those who were widowed, poor, elderly, or socially isolated, as belief in witchcraft grew stronger during periods of instability, turning everyday misfortunes, spoiled milk, sudden illness, a failed harvest, into supposed evidence of malevolent magic. A woman who argued with a neighbour or lived without male protection could become the subject of suspicion, and once labelled a witch, every aspect of her life was reinterpreted as proof of guilt. A birthmark became the devil's mark, a healing herb became poison, and kindness to animals became sorcery. While rumours spread through villages with unstoppable momentum, fueled by sermons, gossip, and fear, until accusations hardened into trials, where innocence was impossible to prove because denial itself was seen as deception. Torture, ensured confessions, and executions reassured communities that order had been restored, even though nothing had truly been solved. Disease created its own mythology of blame, particularly leprosy, which medieval society feared intensely not just as illness, but as moral corruption, leading to rumours that lepers plotted secretly to infect others or overthrow Christian society. These beliefs justified isolating sufferers in colonies, stripping them of legal rights, and sometimes executing them en masse, even though leprosy spread slowly and posed little risk in casual contact, showing how ignorance turned illness into a perceived conspiracy. Rumours also flourished around sexuality and morality, destroying reputations and lives without any physical evidence. A woman accused of adultery or immorality could be publicly shamed, beaten, or killed, while men accused of heresy or sodomy faced imprisonment or execution based largely on testimony extracted through coercion or shaped by personal grudges. Religious dissent amplified this culture of rumour, as the Church sought to preserve doctrinal unity in a world it believed constantly threatened by Satan. Movements deemed heretical were accused of secret orgies, devil worship, and cannibalism, not because such acts occurred, but because portraying dissenters as monstrous justified their eradication, and inquisitorial systems institutionalized rumour by allowing anonymous accusations, meaning anyone could denounce anyone else without accountability, turning fear into a weapon wielded by neighbours, rivals, and authorities alike. Political rumours were just as lethal, as nobles or rulers accused of treason or conspiracy could be undone by whispers suggesting secret alliances, poisonings, or occult practices, with trials often serving as formal rituals to confirm decisions already made, illustrating how rumour functioned as a tool of power rather than a challenge to it. Even natural phenomena were dragged into this cycle of blame. Eclipses, comets, storms, and earthquakes were interpreted as divine warnings tied to human sin, prompting searches for scapegoats whose punishment might restore cosmic order. And when no obvious target existed, rumours created one. What made medieval rumours so destructive was not merely belief but repetition, as stories were reinforced through sermons, tavern talk, marketplaces, and official proclamations, forming a closed loop in which doubt was erased by communal agreement. And once a rumour became common knowledge, resistance was dangerous because defending the accused risked suspicion oneself. Innocent lives were ruined not only through death but through exile, confiscation of property, and generational trauma, as families branded by rumour carried stigma long after the original accusation faded, and entire regions were reshaped demographically by expulsions driven by fear rather than fact. In this world, truth mattered less than cohesion, and justice was subordinate to the emotional need for certainty. Rumours offered simple explanations for complex suffering, and by punishing imagined enemies, societies convinced themselves they were acting righteously. The tragedy of medieval rumour culture lies not only in its brutality, but in its familiarity, because the mechanisms that destroyed innocent lives, fear, repetition, authority, and the human desire for blame, are not relics of the past, but enduring patterns that history exposes in their most extreme and devastating form, reminding us that the greatest danger was never superstition alone, but the willingness to believe without questioning and to punish without proof. As medieval societies evolved, rumours did not fade with time but adapted, embedding themselves deeper into legal systems, religious doctrine, and everyday life, becoming almost indistinguishable from accepted truth. And this institutionalization of rumour made its consequences even more devastating, because it granted fear, the authority of law, and divine approval. Once a community accepted that invisible forces govern misfortune, any deviation from social norms could be interpreted as evidence of hidden guilt, and people learned quickly that survival depended less on innocence and on conformity. In towns and villages, reputation functioned as a fragile shield, and a single accusation, often born from envy, debt, rejected affection, or simple misunderstanding, could shatter it beyond repair. Because medieval justice relied heavily on testimony rather than investigation, and testimony itself was shaped by rumour, expectation, and coercion. A neighbour's repeated suspicion could become communal belief, and communal belief could harden into legal certainty, creating a cycle in which accusation produced confirmation rather than scrutiny. Children were not spared from this system. Rumours about demonic possession or moral corruption could see them subjected to exorcisms, beatings, or confinement, all in the name of spiritual cleansing, while their suffering reinforced the belief that something supernatural must indeed be at work. Travellers and foreigners were especially vulnerable, as unfamiliar accents, clothing, or customs made them convenient vessels for fear, and in times of scarcity or unrest, rumours painted them as spies, thieves, or agents of chaos, leading to lynchings, expulsions, or imprisonment without trial. The absence of centralized communication meant that once a rumor entered circulation, it mutated as it traveled, becoming more extreme with each retelling, stripped of nuance and enriched with horror, until its origin was forgotten and only its emotional impact remained. This was particularly evident during famines, when starvation demanded explanation, and rumors blamed hoarders, sinners, or secret saboteurs, resulting in violent crackdowns that punished imagined crimes while ignoring structural causes like climate, war, or poor governance. Rumors also shaped the treatment of the dead, as unexplained deaths sparked fears of vampires, revenants, or restless spirits, leading communities to exhume bodies, mutilate corpses, or burn remains in an attempt to prevent further harm. Acts that not only desecrated the dead but traumatized the living, reinforcing a worldview in which suspicion extended beyond life itself. In monasteries and courts alike, rumors about corruption, sexual deviance, or secret heresy could dismantle institutions, as monks, priests, or officials accused of hidden sins were removed or executed to preserve the illusion of moral purity, even when accusations were unsupported or entirely fabricated. Women bore a disproportionate share of this burden, as medieval thought linked femininity with weakness, temptation, and deception. As centuries passed, the damage caused by medieval rumors accumulated quietly, leaving scars that were not always visible in chronicles or court records, but persisted in memory, landscape, and inherited fear, because rumor did not merely end lives in moments of violence, it reshaped entire social realities, altering where people lived, whom they trusted, and how communities understood misfortune itself. Villages emptied after waves of accusations, fields went untended when families fled persecution, and trade routes shifted as merchants avoided regions known for sudden violence fueled by suspicion, demonstrating that rumor carried economic and cultural consequences as severe as its human toll. The fear of accusation became a governing force in behavior, encouraging exaggerated displays of piety, public conformity, and ritual obedience, not always out of faith, but out of survival, as people learned that appearing devout mattered more than being just. This performative morality fed the rumor mill further, because those who failed to perform convincingly enough stood out, and standing out was dangerous. Silence, too, became a survival strategy, as witnesses to injustice often chose not to speak, knowing that defending the accused could mark them as accomplices, turning moral courage into a liability rather than a virtue. Over time, this eroded trust not only between individuals, but between people and institutions, because courts and churches that claimed to protect the innocent repeatedly demonstrated their willingness to sacrifice individuals for the illusion of order. Rumors thrived especially in moments when authority felt threatened, during wars, succession crises, or social upheaval, because leaders exploited fear to consolidate power, allowing or even encouraging accusations that redirected public anger away from governance failures and toward vulnerable targets. In such moments, rumor became propaganda, shaping public perception through repetition rather than truth. And once embedded, it proved nearly impossible to dismantle, because admitting error would undermine the very structures that relied on it. The psychological weight of living under constant suspicion shaped medieval consciousness profoundly, fostering a worldview in which danger was invisible, omnipresent, and moralized, making people interpret coincidence as intention and misfortune as punishment. This mindset ensured that rumors never needed to be invented from nothing. They emerged naturally from an environment already primed to expect hidden enemies and secret sins. Even after accusations faded, the memory of them lingered, passing into folklore, local legend, and inherited prejudice, ensuring that future generations would inherit not only stories, but the emotional reflexes that made such stories believable. In this way, rumour became tradition woven into cultural identity, shaping who belonged and who did not, who was trusted and who remained perpetually suspect. The tragedy of these ruined lives lies not only in the violence inflicted, but in the quiet normalization of injustice, as people learn to accept suffering as necessary, deserved, or divinely ordained, absolving themselves of responsibility while participating in cruelty. Medieval rumour culture reveals how easily societies can abandon evidence, empathy, and restraint when fear is given moral authority, and how innocence becomes irrelevant once guilt is assumed by consensus rather than proven by fact. The lives destroyed by these rumours rarely left records of their own voices, yet their absence speaks loudly through the gaps they left behind. Empty homes, erased names, broken families, and silenced futures, reminding us that the greatest harm inflicted by rumour is not only the death of individuals, but the corrosion of humanity itself, a lesson written repeatedly across medieval history in blood, silence, and unmarked graves. Even when the medieval world slowly moved towards stronger legal frameworks and written records, rumour retained its power because it had already shaped how people understood truth itself, teaching generations that belief validated reality rather than the other way around. And this legacy ensured that accusations continued to function as social facts, even when evidence was weak or absent. Courts might record testimonies, but those testimonies were often rehearsed in taverns, churches, and marketplaces long before they reached parchment, polished by repetition until they sounded consistent enough to pass as truth, while contradictions were dismissed as signs of deception rather than proof of innocence. In this environment, justice became less about discovering what had happened and more about restoring emotional equilibrium, satisfying collective anxiety by offering punishment as closure, regardless of who suffered for it. The accused were expected not only to deny the charges, but to dismantle an entire narrative already accepted by their community, an impossible task when rumour had rewritten memory itself, altering how past interactions were recalled and reinterpreted. A casual disagreement months earlier could be remembered as a threat, a moment of kindness could be reframed as manipulation, and coincidence could be transformed into motive, demonstrating how rumour did not merely add false information, but actively reshaped perception. This distortion extended into religious life, where confession and repentance, meant to heal the soul, became tools that reinforced rumour, as people were encouraged to search their consciences for hidden sins, sometimes accepting guilt for crimes they had not committed, simply to end suffering or align themselves with expected narratives of wrongdoing. The line between spiritual guidance and psychological coercion blurred, and the idea that suffering itself was proof of guilt became deeply ingrained, allowing torment to masquerade as moral correction. Over time, rumour taught medieval societies to distrust complexity, favouring simple explanations that identified clear villains, because simplicity felt safer than uncertainty, and certainty, even false certainty, was emotionally preferable to doubt. This preference ensured that once a group or individual had been marked as dangerous, future misfortunes would continue to be blamed on them, creating cycles of persecution that reignited whenever fear resurfaced. Children inherited these assumptions early, absorbing them through stories, sermons, and warnings about forbidden behaviours and dangerous people, learning whom to fear before learning whom to trust, which meant that rumour did not need to be actively taught. It was passively transmitted as common sense. The cumulative effect was a society skilled at identifying enemies, but poor at protecting the innocent, where survival often depended on invisibility rather than virtue, and moral worth was measured by conformity instead of compassion. What makes the medieval experience with rumour especially haunting is not simply the scale of violence it produced, but the calm with which it was often carried out, as executions, expulsions, and confiscations became routine events, framed as necessary maintenance of order, stripping cruelty of its shock and replacing it with ritual and justification. People learned to live alongside injustice without questioning it, because questioning itself became risky, and this normalization ensured that even those who privately doubted accusations often participated publicly, valuing personal safety over truth. In this way, rumour succeeded not only in destroying individual lives, but in reshaping ethical boundaries, teaching societies that belief justified harm, and that doubt was a weakness rather than a safeguard. The innocent who perished under these systems were not victims of isolated ignorance, but casualties of a culture that rewarded certainty over inquiry and fear over empathy. And their erasure serves as a stark reminder that the most dangerous rumours are not those whispered in secrecy, but those spoken openly, endorsed collectively, and enforced with conviction. Because once a society agrees on a lie, it gains the power of truth. And when that happens, innocence becomes irrelevant, mercy becomes suspicious, and destruction becomes not only possible, but inevitable. Long after the specific accusations were forgotten, the patterns that rumours created continued to govern behaviour, embedding themselves so deeply into medieval life that people no longer recognized them as distortions, but as natural laws of existence, shaping how guilt, danger, and belonging were understood. Fear became anticipatory rather than reactive, as individuals learned to police themselves constantly, anticipating how their actions might be interpreted by others, not as they intended them, but as rumour might reshape them. And this anticipation narrowed lives into careful performances, stripped of spontaneity or trust. Social bonds weakened under this pressure, because intimacy itself became risky. To know someone too well was to share in their vulnerability, and if they fell under suspicion, proximity could pull others down with them. Communities that outwardly appeared tightly knit were often internally fragile, held together not by solidarity, but by shared anxiety and the unspoken agreement not to challenge collective judgments. In such an environment, truth became secondary to plausibility, and plausibility was defined by existing fears rather than facts, ensuring that rumours aligned themselves with whatever narratives already dominated local imagination. If the community feared divine punishment, rumours took religious form. If it feared disorder, rumours framed targets as conspirators. If it feared scarcity, rumours accused hoarders or saboteurs, showing how flexible and adaptive falsehood could be when rooted in emotional need. The most insidious aspect of this system was its self-reinforcing nature. As this culture of suspicion persisted, it quietly trained people to reinterpret their own suffering as confirmation that the world was hostile and punitive by design, reinforcing a fatalistic outlook in which misfortune was expected and resistance felt futile, because if harm was always the result of hidden sin or unseen enemies, then suffering was not something to be challenged, but endured. This resignation further empowered rumour, since people who believed catastrophe was inevitable were less likely to question its causes, accepting accusations as part of a cosmic order rather than as human failures. Over time, this worldview dulled empathy, because compassion for the accused risked emotional vulnerability, and vulnerability itself was dangerous in a society where weakness attracted suspicion. People learned to harden themselves, to witness punishment without protest, to look away from suffering, not out of cruelty alone, but out of self-defense. as caring too deeply threatened one's own safety. In this way, rumour did not only destroy those it targeted, it reshaped the moral character of those who survived, teaching them to equate survival with silence and righteousness with obedience. Even love and loyalty were constrained by this logic, as family members sometimes testified against one another under pressure, not necessarily because they believed the accusations, but because refusal invited suspicion, and the system was designed so that betrayal appeared safer than solidarity. The emotional devastation of such betrayals rarely entered official records, yet it lingered in fractured families and communities haunted by guilt they could neither express nor absolve. What makes these histories especially unsettling is the recognition that many who participated in rumour-driven persecution likely believed they were acting responsibly, even morally, because rumour had been sanctified by repetition, authority, and ritual, transforming fear into duty. The machinery of accusation ran smoothly, precisely because it felt normal, because outrage had been routinized and empathy disciplined out of public life. Medieval rumour culture thus reveals a grim truth about human societies, that injustice does not require universal malice, only a shared willingness to accept convenient explanations and to defer moral responsibility to collective belief. Innocent lives were ruined not in moments of chaos alone, but in orderly processes, solemn ceremonies, and quiet agreements, where violence wore the mask of necessity and lies borrowed the language of truth. The echoes of these ruined lives remind us that the danger of rumour lies not merely in its falsity, but in its ability to become structure, shaping laws, habits, and expectations, until questioning it feels unnatural. And by the time doubt arises, the damage has already been done, leaving behind a legacy of loss that history can describe, but never fully repair. The final cruelty of medieval rumour was that it outlived the moments that gave birth to it, lingering long after executions were carried out and names were erased, settling into the soil of collective memory, where it continued to shape behaviour, even in the absence of immediate fear. People remembered not always what had happened, but what they were told had happened, and those stories hardened into moral lessons, warning future generations about the dangers of disobedience, difference, or doubt. Children grew up hearing cautionary tales rooted in rumour, stories of neighbours who were punished for secret sins or mysterious crimes, absorbing fear as wisdom and suspicion as common sense, until distrust felt natural and questioning felt reckless. In this way, rumour became educational, shaping identity before critical thought could take root, ensuring its own survival across centuries. Even moments of peace did not dissolve these beliefs, because calm itself was seen as fragile and temporary, something that could shatter without warning if hidden threats were not constantly policed. And so vigilance never rested. Communities remained alert for signs of danger, reading meaning into ordinary events, interpreting accidents as intention and coincidence as conspiracy, reinforcing a mindset in which the world was never neutral and people were never fully innocent. This constant vigilance exacted a heavy psychological cost, producing lives lived in tension, where joy was restrained, expression was guarded, and trust was conditional. Yet these sacrifices were normalized as the price of safety. Ironically, this pursuit of safety through suspicion made life more dangerous, because it ensured that when crisis struck, communities already primed for fear would react with violence rather than reflection. The absence of empathy in such moments was not accidental, but learned, the result of generations trained to value order over understanding and conformity over compassion. Those who were destroyed by rumour rarely left behind stories of resistance, not because they lacked courage, but because resistance itself was erased, reframed as further proof of guilt, leaving silence as the only legacy permitted to them. Their humanity was stripped away piece by piece, until they existed only as symbols of danger or sin, making their destruction feel abstract and therefore acceptable. This abstraction is perhaps the most chilling achievement of rumor culture, because once people are no longer seen as individuals, cruelty requires no justification beyond repetition. Medieval societies did not merely believe rumors, they built lives around them, structured institutions through them, and justified suffering with them, demonstrating how falsehood, when shared widely enough, acquires the authority of truth and the power of law. The innocent lives ruined by these stories were casualties of a deeper failure: the refusal to tolerate uncertainty, the fear of complexity, and the human impulse to seek meaning in blame rather than understanding. Their loss stands as a reminder that the greatest violence does not always arrive with chaos and rage, but often with agreement, ritual, and calm conviction. When a society convinces itself that harm is necessary, and once necessity is accepted, innocence becomes irrelevant. Beyond the immediate devastation, medieval rumor culture hollowed out the possibility of moral learning, because societies that justified violence through belief had no incentive to reflect on error, and without reflection, mistakes hardened into tradition. When innocent people were destroyed, and nothing visibly collapsed afterward, communities interpreted survival itself as confirmation that their actions had been correct, reinforcing the idea that cruelty had preserved order rather than undermined it. This false confirmation loop was especially powerful because consequences were delayed or displaced. The emotional damage, demographic loss, and cultural stagnation caused by rumor unfolded slowly over generations, making it easy to deny responsibility and difficult to trace cause and effect. By the time villages declined or trust eroded, the original accusations were long forgotten, replaced by new fears and new targets, while the underlying pattern remained intact. In this way, rumor functioned as a renewable resource of control, endlessly adaptable and never exhausted, because it required no evidence and produced its own justification. Even attempts at reform struggled against this inertia, as efforts to introduce stricter legal standards or limit torture were often resisted by those who believed that doubt weakened divine order and mercy invited disaster. To question rumor was to question the moral foundation of the community itself, and few were willing to risk isolation or accusation for the sake of abstract justice. Thus, silence became a form of complicity, not always chosen freely, but normalized as wisdom. People learned to tell themselves that they had no power, that events were beyond their control, that authority knew best, narratives that eased guilt while preserving the system that caused it. Over time, this cultivated a tragic duality in medieval life: deep religious devotion coexisting with profound moral numbness, intense communal identity paired with routine exclusion and violence. Compassion survived, but often privately, hidden within households or whispered prayers, because public empathy was dangerous. The cost of this secrecy was immense, as goodness became fragmented and isolated, unable to challenge collective harm. Rumor thus achieved its most enduring victory, not simply by killing the innocent, but by teaching the living to adapt to injustice, to normalize fear, and to accept suffering as inevitable. The medieval world did not collapse under the weight of these lies, it endured, which made the lies harder to see. And that endurance itself stands as a warning, because it shows how deeply a society can wound itself and still function, mistaking survival for righteousness and continuity for truth. At its deepest level, the tragedy of medieval rumor was that it replaced moral responsibility with collective momentum, allowing individuals to dissolve their conscience into the crowd and feel absolved simply by acting in unison. When everyone believed the same story, no one felt personally accountable for its consequences, and this diffusion of guilt made extraordinary cruelty feel ordinary, even forgettable. People could return home after witnessing punishment, share meals, pray and sleep, not because they were monsters, but because rumour had taught them that what they had seen was necessary, ordained, and beyond question. This psychological insulation was essential to the survival of rumour culture, because without it, the weight of injustice would have been unbearable. Instead, societies learned to compartmentalize suffering, to treat it as an unfortunate but unavoidable byproduct of order, much like disease or famine. And even then, the damage was not finished, because a society that learns to look away does not merely forget the innocent. It learns to mistrust innocence itself. Over time, claims of innocence came to sound naive, even suspicious, because experience had taught people that danger often hid behind ordinary appearances, and that trust was a liability rather than a virtue. This inversion of values completed the moral reversal rumour had begun, turning skepticism toward accusation into foolishness, and skepticism toward fear into recklessness. In such a climate, people stopped asking whether someone deserved punishment, and began asking whether sparing them might invite risk, a question that always favoured action over restraint, because action created the illusion of control. The innocent thus faced a paradox they could not escape. To assert innocence too strongly was to appear defensive, and to accept accusation quietly was to confirm it, leaving no path that did not end in suspicion. This impossible bind ensured that once a rumour gained momentum, resistance collapsed inward, and even those targeted began to doubt their own worth, internalizing blame simply to make sense of suffering that otherwise felt arbitrary. Rumour did not only condemn bodies, it invaded minds, teaching victims to search themselves for faults that might justify what was happening, because believing there was a reason felt less terrifying than accepting randomness. This internalization of guilt was perhaps the most intimate violence rumour inflicted, because it denied victims even the refuge of knowing they were wronged. Their suffering became personalized, stripped of context, and absorbed into shame, while the society around them moved on, reassured that justice, however brutal, had been done. Meanwhile, those who remained learned to interpret this silence as confirmation, mistaking the absence of protest for acceptance and acceptance for truth. Each unchallenged outcome reinforced the lesson that the system worked, that order was preserved, and that fear had been managed effectively, even though the cost was borne by those least able to defend themselves. Over time, this created a chilling emotional economy in which empathy was rationed, doubt was discouraged, and moral courage was treated as impractical. People did not become less human, they became more cautious, and caution, elevated to the highest virtue, crowded out generosity, trust, and solidarity. The medieval world thus perfected a form of cruelty that did not require constant violence, only readiness for it, a posture of perpetual suspicion that shaped behaviour long before accusation struck. Innocent lives continued to be ruined, not always through dramatic trials or executions, but through abandonment, isolation, and the slow withdrawal of protection, a social death that often preceded physical harm and sometimes replaced it entirely. These quieter endings rarely entered records, yet they reveal how thoroughly rumour had redefined harm, making exclusion feel safer than inclusion, and silence feel wiser than defence. In the end, medieval rumours did not simply destroy the innocent, they taught entire societies how to live in a way that made such destruction feel reasonable, even unavoidable, and that lesson, once learned, proved far harder to undo than any single lie. And with that lesson embedded, the medieval world reached a state where fear no longer needed to be justified at all, because it had become self-evident, a basic assumption about how life worked and how people should behave. Danger was presumed to exist everywhere, hidden beneath normality, and this presumption shaped judgment before facts could intervene. People learned to see accusation not as a rupture of order, but as its confirmation, proof that vigilance was active, and that society remained alert to threats. In this context, the suffering of the innocent did not feel like failure. It felt like collateral certainty, an unfortunate but acceptable byproduct of staying safe. The question shifted from whether harm was justified to whether it had been distributed in a way that preserved stability, and stability became the highest moral good. Once stability was elevated above justice, rumour gained absolute freedom, because anything that threatened cohesion could be framed as dangerous, and anything framed as dangerous could be removed. This logic was devastating precisely because it felt reasonable, grounded not in rage, but in caution, not in hatred, but in risk management. Ordinary people could participate in extraordinary harm while believing themselves prudent rather than cruel, responsible rather than complicit. Over time, this belief insulated conscience, allowing individuals to maintain a sense of personal decency even as collective behavior grew increasingly ruthless. The innocent who suffered under this regime were often described not as wronged, but as unfortunate, a subtle linguistic shift that removed agency and responsibility from their fate. Misfortune simply happened to them, as if by nature, rather than being inflicted by human choice, and this framing made it easier to accept loss without demanding accountability. Rumour thus succeeded in transforming injustice into fate, a force to be endured rather than confronted. Even acts of remorse were shaped by this worldview, expressed as generalized sorrow for suffering rather than specific recognition of wrongdoing, ensuring that sympathy never matured into change. The medieval world became skilled at mourning without memory, grieving without learning, and continuing without correcting, because correction threatened the narratives that made fear manageable. Innocent lives continued to vanish into this system, not because people were unaware of the cost, but because acknowledging the cost fully would have required dismantling the very mechanisms that promised safety, and so the mechanisms endured, reinforced by habit, defended by tradition, and justified by the quiet belief that things could not be otherwise. This is the final, sobering truth revealed by the long history of medieval rumour, that when societies accept fear as a foundation, they do not need to actively choose cruelty again and again. Cruelty becomes automatic, built into how decisions are made and how events are interpreted. In such a world, innocence is not protected by truth, because truth itself has been subordinated to survival, and survival has been defined not by humanity, but by the ability to endure a system that quietly consumes the most vulnerable while calling the result order. And from that point onward, the machinery required no further refinement, because it had already learned how to reproduce itself without instruction, operating through expectation, habit, and fear rather than command. People no longer needed to be told whom to suspect. Suspicion emerged automatically, guided by inherited instincts and reinforced by social cues so subtle they felt natural. A hesitation, a difference in manner, an absence from ritual, any small deviation could activate the old reflexes, because the culture had trained itself to treat irregularity as threat. In such a world, moral responsibility dissolved not through denial, but through diffusion, scattered so widely across collective behavior that no single individual could see themselves as the source of harm. Everyone participated a little, and because participation was partial, guilt felt diluted, manageable, and therefore ignorable. This diffusion was essential to the endurance of rumour culture, because systems that assign clear responsibility invite resistance, while systems that spread it invite compliance. The innocent who were ruined by rumour thus faced not a single enemy, but a fog of reactions, glances, withdrawals, and quiet agreements that together formed an impenetrable barrier. There was no one to appeal to, no clear injustice to confront, because each step in the process appeared minor, reasonable, even cautious when viewed in isolation. A neighbor stopped visiting. A merchant refused service. A priest offered warning instead of defense. An official delayed intervention. None of these acts alone destroyed a life, yet together they ensured that destruction occurred without spectacle, without protest, and without reckoning. This gradual unraveling was often more devastating than open violence, because it denied victims the clarity of opposition, leaving them isolated within a society that no longer acknowledged them as fully present. Rumour thrived in this ambiguity, because ambiguity allowed fear to masquerade as prudence, and withdrawal to masquerade as neutrality. Over time, communities grew adept at this form of quiet exclusion, refining it into a social skill, one that preserved order while minimizing visible cruelty. The absence of overt brutality made the system feel humane, even as it continued to ruin lives, and this appearance of restraint further insulated it from criticism. People told themselves they were better than their ancestors, less violent, more civilized, while continuing to enact the same patterns through softer means. Innocence, still lacking narrative power, remained defenseless against this evolution, because even mercy now required justification, and justification was always weighed against risk. The calculus never favored the vulnerable, and so the medieval world moved forward carrying its fears intact, having learned how to manage them efficiently, quietly, and with minimal disruption to everyday life. The cost of this efficiency was borne by those who disappeared without trial, without memory, and often without acknowledgement, their lives absorbed into a system that functioned precisely because it did not need to see them as lives at all. And with that disappearance came the final refinement of rumour's power, the ability to erase not only people, but the very expectation that anyone should notice their absence. And with that expectation, who would be next died? The medieval world settled into a rhythm, where anticipation itself became a form of control, guiding behaviour more effectively than any decree or punishment ever could. People learned to sense when danger was approaching, not through evidence, but through shifts in mood, whispers growing louder, glances lingering too long, and sermons tightening their language, and this sensitivity became a survival skill, passed quietly from one generation to the next. Anticipation taught restraint before accusation even appeared, shaping choices in advance, and reducing the need for overt force, because most people had already adjusted themselves to fit within the boundaries rumour enforced. This preemptive obedience was perhaps the most efficient outcome of rumour culture, as it minimized resistance while maximizing conformity, creating a society that disciplined itself through fear of interpretation rather than fear of law. Innocence mattered less than predictability, and those who could not make themselves predictable because of poverty, illness, temperament, or circumstance remained permanently exposed. Their vulnerability was not always the result of hostility, but of inconvenience, because they disrupted the fragile sense of control rumour promised, and disruption demanded correction. Correction, once framed as necessity, no longer felt like violence, but like maintenance, a grim form of social housekeeping carried out with solemn faces and clean consciences. This framing allowed people to participate without feeling cruel, to witness without feeling complicit, and to forget without feeling dishonest. Over time, this emotional insulation reshaped collective memory, smoothing over moments of doubt and amplifying moments of confirmation, until the past appeared to justify the present and the present prepared the ground for repetition. Even when individuals privately sensed that accusations had gone too far, that punishment exceeded harm, that fear had outrun reason, those thoughts rarely matured into action, because action required visibility, and visibility invited danger. Silence, by contrast, felt prudent, and prudence was praised as wisdom in a world where survival depended on restraint. Thus, the cost of speaking grew heavier with each unchallenged injustice, until silence itself became a moral norm rather than a compromise. The innocent lives ruined under these conditions were not only victims of false belief, but of a culture that had learned to equate safety with agreement and wisdom with caution, leaving little room for courage that did not align with power. Their suffering exposed the fragility of a society built on fear, yet that fragility was carefully hidden beneath routines, rituals, and continuity, making harm appear episodic rather than structural. The medieval world did not collapse under the weight of rumour, because rumour distributed harm selectively, targeting the few to stabilise the many, a strategy that preserved order while steadily draining it of justice. This selective destruction created the illusion that danger was being managed, when in reality it was being rehearsed until accusation felt inevitable, and innocence felt naive. And in that environment, the most tragic loss was not only the lives taken, but the gradual disappearance of the belief that truth could protect, that mercy could intervene, or that fear itself could be questioned. Once those beliefs faded, rumour no longer needed to shout or threaten, it only needed to exist, quietly shaping expectation, narrowing possibility, and ensuring that when the next whisper began, the world was already prepared to believe it. And so the long arc of medieval rumour culture completed its work not with a final catastrophe, but with permanence, embedding itself so deeply into social instinct that it no longer required crisis to justify its existence. Fear became self-sustaining, no longer dependent on famine, plague, or war, because people had learned to expect danger even in moments of calm, reading threat into normality itself. Peace did not dissolve suspicion. It sharpened it because calm was understood as fragile, something that could shatter at any moment if vigilance failed. This belief ensured that rumour always had a foothold, waiting patiently for the smallest irregularity to awaken it. A failed harvest in an otherwise prosperous year, a child's unexplained illness in an otherwise healthy town, a disagreement in an otherwise obedient household. Any deviation was enough to reactivate old reflexes, because the culture had been trained to respond to difference, not with curiosity, but with alarm. In this environment, moral exhaustion became widespread, as people carried the constant burden of monitoring themselves and others, guarding against suspicion, while quietly fearing that no amount of caution could guarantee safety. This exhaustion did not produce rebellion, it produced compliance, because challenging the system required energy and courage that many no longer possessed. Over time, compliance hardened into worldview, and worldview into identity, until people could no longer imagine themselves outside the logic that governed them. The innocent who were ruined by rumour thus became casualties not of a single lie, but of a culture that had lost the capacity to pause, to reflect, and to tolerate uncertainty. Their destruction did not shock, because shock itself had been worn down by repetition, and repetition had taught society that suffering was manageable so long as it was unevenly distributed. The medieval world learned to function by sacrificing the few to reassure the many. And once this lesson was internalized, rumour became indispensable, because it provided a continuous supply of meaning, control, and justification. Even remorse was absorbed into the system, expressed as abstract sorrow rather than concrete change, allowing people to grieve without questioning, to regret without reforming, and to mourn without remembering. In this way, rumour achieved its final transformation from story to structure, from accusation to atmosphere, from fear to habit, shaping not only what people believed, but how they lived. The innocent lives it ruined were not merely lost. They were consumed by a system that depended on their disappearance to sustain itself, leaving behind a society that survived, endured, and persisted, yet did so at the cost of its moral imagination. And in that loss lies the enduring warning of medieval rumour, that when fear is allowed to organise society, justice becomes optional, innocence becomes irrelevant, and cruelty no longer requires hatred, only habit. And even after habit replaced hatred, the system remained fragile in a way that few could articulate, because a society organized around fear must constantly feed that fear to justify itself. And rumour provided the most efficient nourishment. Each generation inherited not only caution but anxiety, learning early that safety was conditional, and that acceptance could be withdrawn without warning. This inheritance shaped emotional life from childhood onward, teaching people to measure themselves against invisible standards and to fear missteps they could not fully define. The result was a pervasive insecurity that rumour both exploited and intensified, creating a feedback loop in which fear justified accusation and accusation deepened fear. In such a loop, there was no natural end point, no moment of resolution, only temporary relief followed by renewed vigilance. Innocence could never close the cycle, because innocence offered no explanation, no reassurance, and no control. And control was what people craved, most in a world that felt unpredictable and dangerous. Over time, the desire for control outweighed the desire for fairness, and fairness itself came to be seen as a luxury rather than a necessity, something admirable in theory, but impractical in practice. This pragmatic cruelty allowed people to believe they were realistic rather than ruthless, sensible rather than severe, even as they participated in the destruction of lives they barely knew. The language surrounding accusation reflected this shift, becoming increasingly impersonal, framed in terms of necessity, protection, and prevention, words that obscured human cost and transformed suffering into abstraction. Once suffering became abstract, it became easier to tolerate, easier to forget, and easier to repeat. The medieval world thus learned not only how to accuse, but how to move on, to resume ordinary life after extraordinary harm, treating each episode as isolated rather than symptomatic. This selective attention ensured that patterns remained invisible. Even as they repeated with chilling consistency, people remembered events, but not systems, stories but not structures, outcomes but not processes. Without understanding the process, there could be no interruption, only reenactment. The innocent lives ruined by rumour were therefore not warnings that changed behaviour, but sacrifices that reinforced it, teaching others how to survive by staying within the narrowing boundaries of acceptability. As those boundaries tightened, the space for difference, dissent, and mercy shrank until conformity itself became a moral imperative. In such a world, to be good was to be cautious, to be wise was to be silent, and to be safe was to be unremarkable. This redefinition of virtue ensured that rumour remained powerful, even without belief, because it shaped behaviour regardless of conviction. People did not need to be convinced of a story's truth to act on it. They only needed to believe that others might believe it. And that belief was enough to ruin lives, because it made fear contagious and restraint rare. The deepest tragedy is that many never realized what had been lost, because they had grown accustomed to living with less justice than their humanity required. And so the medieval world carried on, outwardly stable, yet inwardly narrowed. Its rhythms intact, even as its moral range diminished, because rumour had taught people how to endure without examining what endurance required them to accept. Over time, the capacity to feel shock at injustice weakened, replaced by a resigned understanding that suffering was part of the order of things, something to be navigated rather than challenged. This resignation did not eliminate fear. It refined it, transforming raw panic into disciplined alertness, a constant low-level awareness that danger might emerge at any moment and that survival depended on reading signs correctly. People learned to watch not only others, but themselves, censoring thoughts before words, words before actions, actions before associations until self-surveillance became second nature. In this climate, the line between prudence and betrayal blurred, because protecting oneself often required distancing from those marked by suspicion, even when they were known to be harmless, even when abandonment felt wrong. Such choices accumulated quietly, shaping character through repetition, until people no longer recognized them as choices at all, but as necessities imposed by reality. Rumour thus achieved its most complete form of control by convincing individuals that they were merely responding to circumstances rather than participating in their creation. The destruction of innocent lives became background noise, tragic but expected, mourned briefly, if at all, then absorbed into the collective understanding that danger had been addressed. Each loss reinforced the belief that vigilance worked, even when nothing truly improved, and this belief sustained the cycle more effectively than fear alone ever could. The medieval world did not need constant terror to function. It needed only the memory of terror, preserved through stories, warnings, and inherited caution, ensuring that rumour always had fertile ground in which to grow. This memory shaped how people interpreted the past and anticipated the future, anchoring them to familiar narratives, even when those narratives had caused immense harm. Innocence, stripped of narrative usefulness, offered no such anchor, and so it was easily sacrificed when certainty demanded it. What remains, when viewed from a distance, is not merely a catalogue of false accusations or brutal punishments, but a portrait of how societies can slowly acclimate to injustice until it feels ordinary, even necessary. Medieval rumours ruined innocent lives, not only through dramatic acts of violence, but through the steady erosion of empathy, responsibility, and imagination, until people could no longer picture a world in which fear was not the guiding principle. And once that picture was lost, so too was the possibility of protecting the innocent, because protection requires the belief that things could be otherwise, a belief rumour worked tirelessly and successfully to erase. Beyond that erosion of imagination came a subtler loss, the fading of moral urgency. When injustice becomes routine, it no longer demands response. It becomes weather. Unfortunate, sometimes devastating, but fundamentally outside human control. Medieval rumour culture thrived in this psychological climate, because it encouraged people to see accusation and punishment not as choices, but as reactions, automatic and therefore blameless. Events unfolded as if on their own momentum, and individuals experienced themselves less as actors than as witnesses carried along by necessity. This sense of inevitability drained ethical life of its sharp edges, smoothing outrage into acceptance and transforming tragedy into expectation. People still felt sorrow, but it was a muted sorrow, quickly disciplined by the reminder that questioning outcomes invited danger. Grief was allowed only so long as it did not turn into doubt. In this way, emotional expression itself was regulated, shaped by fear of appearing sympathetic to the wrong person, and compassion learned to hide behind silence. Over time, this emotional restraint hardened into habit, making indifference appear mature and detachment appear wise. The innocent who suffered under these conditions were not only deprived of justice, but of witnesses willing to feel fully on their behalf. And this absence of witness compounded their erasure, leaving suffering unacknowledged even as it unfolded. Rumour benefited from this numbness, because it required little resistance once empathy had been dulled. Accusations could circulate without provoking the moral friction that might have slowed them. Each unchallenged story made the next easier to believe. Each unprotested punishment lowered the threshold for the next, until destruction could proceed with minimal emotional disturbance. The medieval world thus became adept at absorbing harm, distributing it unevenly while preserving a sense of normalcy, a skill that allowed society to persist, but at the cost of its moral vitality. Innocent lives were ruined not in spite of this normalcy, but because of it, because normalcy provided cover for cruelty, allowing fear-driven actions to appear orderly rather than brutal. This quiet accommodation of injustice is what gave rumour its lasting power, ensuring that even when evidence was thin and accusations implausible, the machinery of belief continued to operate smoothly. In the end, what medieval rumour culture reveals most clearly is not simply how false stories can kill, but how repeated compromise with fear can teach entire societies to live alongside injustice without feeling compelled to stop it. And still the process advanced, almost imperceptibly, as generations inherited not only stories, but reflexes, learning when to tense, when to withdraw, and when to agree without needing to be told why. Medieval rumour culture did not rely on constant instruction. It relied on atmosphere, on the quiet understanding that safety came from alignment and danger from deviation. This understanding shaped social instincts so thoroughly that people often felt fear before they felt thought, suspicion before curiosity, and certainty before doubt. In such conditions, rumour no longer needed to persuade. It only needed to resonate, to echo what people already felt but could not name. Accusations sounded true because they matched an emotional landscape prepared by years of uncertainty and restraint. And once they sounded true, action followed with little resistance. The tragic efficiency of this system lay in its ability to convert emotion into judgment without pause, collapsing the space where reflection might have intervened. Every crisis reinforced the lesson that speed mattered more than accuracy, that hesitation was dangerous, and that mercy could invite catastrophe. Over time, these lessons reshaped ethical priorities, making decisiveness appear virtuous even when it was cruel, and caution appear weak even when it was wise. The innocent who were caught in this machinery were often those who embodied ambiguity, people who did not fit neatly into expected roles, whose lives resisted easy explanation, and whose very complexity made them threatening in a culture that craved clarity. Their destruction simplified the social landscape, removing discomfort at the cost of humanity, and this simplification felt like relief. Relief, however, was always temporary, because the underlying anxiety remained unresolved, ready to attach itself to the next suitable target. This ensured that rumour never exhausted itself, it merely moved on. The medieval world thus lived in a state of perpetual readiness, braced for danger yet unable to escape it, because the methods used to manage fear ensured its survival. Innocent lives continued to be ruined, not as anomalies, but as outputs of a system that had learned to function through sacrifice. The most haunting aspect of this history is not how loudly people accused, but how quietly they adapted, adjusting their expectations, lowering their moral thresholds, and teaching themselves to live with less justice than they might otherwise have demanded. In doing so, they preserved social order while steadily eroding the values that might have made that order worth preserving. This erosion left behind a world capable of endurance, but fragile in conscience, one that survived by narrowing its sense of obligation until only belonging remained sacred. And in a society where belonging mattered more than truth, rumour did not need to be proven to be fatal. It only needed to be shared, accepted, and left unchallenged long enough for innocence to disappear without protest. And at last, the quietest consequence of all emerged, a society that no longer recognized the loss it had normalized. When innocent lives vanished under rumor, their absence did not create a void large enough to disrupt daily rhythms, because those rhythms had already adapted to exclusion, erasure, and fear. Markets reopened, prayers continued, seasons turned, and life went on. And this continuity became the strongest argument that nothing fundamentally wrong had occurred. People pointed to the persistence of order as evidence of justice, mistaking survival for moral success, unaware that what had survived was not righteousness but habit. Habit allowed memory to dull, turning specific acts of cruelty into vague recollections, and vague recollections into silence, until even silence felt natural. Over time, communities forgot not only the names of those destroyed, but the very possibility that they might have been innocent, because innocence complicated a story that had already been settled. The past hardened into cautionary myth rather than contested reality, and myth does not ask to be questioned, it asks to be obeyed. In this way, rumor achieved its most complete victory by shaping not just action, but memory itself, ensuring that future generations inherited fear without understanding its origin. Beyond even that, there is the lingering recognition that medieval rumor culture reshaped not only how people acted, but how they imagined responsibility itself, slowly transferring moral agency away from individuals and into abstractions like fate, divine will, tradition, or communal necessity. When harm occurred, it was no longer done by anyone in particular. It simply happened, carried out by forces larger than human choice. And this framing absolved participants while preserving the system intact. People could say they had no choice, that events unfolded as they must, that resisting would have been foolish or dangerous. And these explanations became so normalized that they felt honest rather than evasive. Over time, this erosion of agency created a society skilled at obedience, but uncomfortable with accountability, one in which moral reflection was replaced by ritual affirmation, and ethical doubt was treated as a threat rather than a safeguard. Rumor flourished in this environment because it thrived on inevitability. Once a story felt unavoidable, opposing it seemed not only risky but pointless. The destruction of innocent lives thus became framed as tragedy, without perpetrators, sorrow without guilt, loss without responsibility, a narrative that allowed grief to exist without leading to change. This separation of suffering from accountability ensured that lessons were never fully learned, only repeated, because without ownership there could be no correction. Even acts of regret were often abstract, expressed as prayers for mercy rather than commitments to reform, reinforcing the idea that injustice was a spiritual matter rather than a social one. In this way, rumor redirected moral energy away from prevention and toward resignation, encouraging people to endure cruelty rather than dismantle its causes. The result was a world in which empathy survived, mainly a sentiment stripped of the power to intervene, while fear retained its authority as a guide to action. The innocent who were ruined by rumor became symbols of misfortune rather than injustice. Their suffering folded into a worldview that accepted loss as inevitable, rather than preventable. This framing was perhaps the final triumph of rumor culture, because it ensured that even awareness of harm did not threaten the structures that caused it. Medieval society could acknowledge suffering while continuing to reproduce it, mourn victims while preparing the ground for the next accusation, and speak of mercy while enforcing belief through violence. The legacy of this pattern is not only historical but ethical, reminding us that the most dangerous systems are those that allow people to feel blameless while doing harm, and that when responsibility dissolves into collective belief, innocence becomes defenseless, because no one feels obliged to protect it. At that point, rumour ceased to be an event and became an atmosphere, something breathed rather than spoken, shaping reactions before thought could intervene and guiding judgment without ever announcing itself as judgment. People no longer needed explicit accusations to feel fear. They sensed danger intuitively, reading it into glances, silences, misfortunes, and coincidences. And this intuition felt wiser than reason because it promised speed and safety. The world was interpreted through implication rather than evidence. And implication was endlessly flexible, capable of turning anything into confirmation once suspicion had taken root. A sickness following an argument, a storm after a perceived offence, a child's cry near an unpopular neighbour. Each became a thread in a story already waiting to be told. This readiness to connect unrelated events created a reality in which innocence was constantly at risk, not because people actively sought victims, but because meaning itself had become predatory, hunting for explanations that aligned with fear. In such a reality, to exist was to be interpretable, and to be interpretable was to be vulnerable. Lives unfolded under permanent evaluation, measured not by intention or character, but by how easily they could be fitted into an existing narrative of threat. This condition produced a quiet exhaustion, a constant vigilance that drained emotional resilience and narrowed the capacity for joy, because joy implied safety, and safety was never assumed. Rumour ensured that peace always felt provisional, something that could collapse at any moment, if vigilance slipped, reinforcing the belief that fear was not a problem to be solved, but a tool to be maintained. Even moments of kindness were cautious, limited by the awareness that generosity toward the wrong person could itself provoke suspicion, transforming compassion into liability. Over time, this calculus taught people to ration empathy, extending it only where it carried minimal risk, and withdrawing it where it might complicate survival. The result was not a society devoid of feeling, but one in which feeling was disciplined, controlled, and subordinated to fear. Innocent lives were ruined not only when accusations struck, but long before, as possibility itself was constrained by anticipation of rumour, shaping choices, relationships, and futures around what could safely be believed. This long, slow narrowing of life rarely appears in records, because it left no single moment to chronicle, no spectacle to condemn. Yet it represents one of the most pervasive forms of harm inflicted by rumour culture. It ensured that even those who were never accused lived diminished lives, shaped by avoidance rather than aspiration, conformity rather than conviction. In this sense, medieval rumour did not merely destroy its victims. It redefined what it meant to live at all, teaching people to accept fear as the price of belonging and silence as the condition of survival, until the loss of innocence, both individual and collective, felt not tragic but normal. And from that normalization emerged a final, almost invisible transformation, the gradual loss of the ability to imagine a world without suspicion. When rumour governs long enough, it does not merely distort reality. It narrows the horizon of what people believe is possible. Medieval societies came to accept fear, not as a temporary response to crisis, but as a permanent condition of existence, something woven into the fabric of daily life like work, prayer, and obligation. People did not ask how to eliminate fear, only how to manage it, and rumour offered a familiar method: identify, accuse, remove. This pattern felt reliable, even comforting, because it promised action in the face of helplessness, and action, however misguided, felt better than uncertainty. Over generations, this habit replaced moral imagination with procedural thinking. When something went wrong, the response was no longer to ask why, but to ask who. Responsibility shifted from systems to individuals, from structures to scapegoats, and this shift allowed deeper causes of suffering to remain untouched. Poverty, disease, inequality, and violence persisted, while rumour ensured that their effects were blamed on the vulnerable, rather than the powerful, preserving existing hierarchies by redirecting anger downward. In this way, rumour did not simply coexist with power, it served it, protecting authority by offering expendable targets whose punishment reassured the majority that order was being maintained. Those targets were rarely random. They were chosen from the margins, where defense was weakest and belief was easiest to impose. Once destroyed, they left behind lessons written not in words but in fear, teaching others how to avoid the same fate through silence, obedience, and self-erasure. The cumulative effect of these lessons was a society skilled at endurance, but poor at justice, capable of surviving almost anything except introspection. Even when conditions improved, when famine eased or disease retreated, the reflexes remained, ready to activate at the next sign of instability, because fear had become habitual and rumour had become its language. Innocent lives continued to be ruined, not because danger was always present, but because danger was always expected. This expectation ensured that suspicion never slept, that belief always outran evidence, and that mercy remained conditional and fragile. The deepest tragedy is that many within these societies likely sensed, at some level, that something was wrong, that suffering exceeded necessity, that accusations came too easily, yet the cost of voicing that awareness felt greater than the cost of silence. And so silence prevailed, carrying injustice forward quietly, efficiently, and with little resistance. In the end, medieval rumour culture stands as a stark reminder that the greatest threats to innocence are not always violence or hatred, but habits of thought, habits that reward certainty over humility, belonging over conscience, and action over understanding, because once those habits take root, rumour no longer needs to be believed to be deadly. It only needs to be accepted. Beyond even acceptance, there came a point where rumour no longer needed reinforcement at all, because its logic had fused with identity, shaping how people understood themselves in relation to the world. To be a good member of society meant not merely obeying laws or practicing faith, but aligning one's instincts with communal suspicion, learning to feel unease at the right things and people, and suppressing discomfort when punishment followed. Moral intuition was trained outward rather than inward, calibrated to social signals instead of personal conscience, until right and wrong were measured by reaction rather than reflection. In this state, questioning an accusation felt less like seeking justice and more like violating etiquette, an inappropriate disruption of social order rather than a moral necessity. Rumour thus became self-policing, embedded in tone, posture, silence, and shared glances. At the deepest layer of this history is the realization that medieval rumour did not merely respond to fear. It trained fear itself, shaping what people expected from the world and from one another. Danger was assumed to be hidden. Intentions were assumed to be deceptive, and innocence was assumed to be fragile at best, an assumption that fundamentally altered how trust functioned in daily life. Trust became conditional and temporary, granted only so long as someone remained unmarked by suspicion, and withdrawn instantly once a rumour brushed against their name. This instability meant that relationships were always provisional, friendships always cautious, and loyalty always tested against self-preservation. In such a climate, moral ideals could exist only in theory, because practicing them carried tangible risk, and the cost of being right could be exile, imprisonment, or death. Over time, this reality taught people to redefine goodness not as courage or compassion, but as prudence, discretion, and alignment with prevailing belief. The highest virtue became the ability to avoid notice, to remain uninteresting to rumour, and this quiet aspiration shaped lives in ways that rarely appear in records, but deeply influenced how people moved, spoke, and dreamed. Ambition was tempered, curiosity restrained, difference suppressed, because standing out was dangerous even when it was admirable. The culture that resulted was not merely violent but constricting, limiting the range of human expression long before any accusation was ever spoken aloud. Rumour thrived in this narrow space because it required contrast. It needed someone who deviated just enough to become believable as a threat. Once identified, that person carried the accumulated fears of the community, becoming a container for anxieties that had nowhere else to go. Their destruction provided momentary relief, a sense that danger had been addressed, even though the underlying conditions that produced fear remained unchanged. This cycle ensured repetition, because relief faded quickly and fear returned, searching again for form and target. The tragedy lies in how predictable this process was, and how rarely it was recognized as such by those caught inside it. Each generation believed its fears were unique, its accusations necessary, its victims unfortunate but unavoidable, never seeing that they were reenacting inherited patterns rather than responding to new realities. The absence of historical self-awareness allowed rumour to masquerade as wisdom passed down through experience, rather than as trauma passed down through habit. Those who suffered under these systems became part of the unspoken foundation of society, their loss absorbed into the background, their names fading while the structures that destroyed them endured. What survives of them is not testimony but implication, visible only in the rigidity of social norms, the suspicion embedded in custom, and the fear encoded in law. Medieval rumour thus stands as a stark example of how societies can organise themselves around unexamined belief, turning survival into a moral argument and repetition into justification. The innocent lives it ruined remind us that injustice does not always announce itself with chaos or cruelty. Often it arrives quietly, carried by familiar stories, sustained by ordinary choices, and defended by the comforting belief that what everyone agrees upon must be true. And so the cycle closed in on itself, not with resolution but with normalization. As medieval societies learned to inhabit a moral landscape shaped by rumour so thoroughly that alternatives became almost unimaginable. Over time, fear ceased to feel like an intrusion, and instead became a condition of belonging, a shared emotional language through which people recognized one another as members of the same threatened world. To fear together was to belong together, and to reject fear, to question accusations, to ask for proof, to hesitate before punishment, was to risk separation from the collective body. This dynamic gave rumour extraordinary resilience, because it offered not only explanations for suffering, but also a sense of unity, binding communities through shared anxiety and shared targets. Even compassion was filtered through this lens, permitted only when it did not disrupt consensus, confined to private moments where it could not challenge public narratives. As a result, moral life became fragmented, with public virtue and private doubt existing side by side, but never allowed to meet. People learned to live with this division, to act one way outwardly and feel another inwardly, gradually numbing the discomfort until it felt normal. This internal splitting was one of rumour's most enduring harms, because it taught people to distrust their own moral instincts, to treat empathy as dangerous and doubt as weakness. Over generations, such lessons reshaped conscience itself, making it easier to accept injustice, not as a failure, but as an unfortunate necessity. The destruction of innocent lives thus became woven into the fabric of normal life, not as an aberration, but as a background risk, something tragic yet expected, like famine or disease. And because it was expected, it was rarely resisted. The medieval world did not lack kindness or faith, but it lacked space for uncertainty. And without uncertainty, there was no room for mercy that challenged belief. Rumour filled that absence completely, offering certainty at the cost of humanity. And societies paid that cost repeatedly, without ever fully accounting for it. The innocent who were ruined by these stories were not remembered as individuals, but as functions of fear, their lives reduced to lessons about danger and obedience. Yet their silent absence speaks across centuries, revealing how easily fear can be mistaken for wisdom, and how readily societies can sacrifice the innocent to preserve a sense of order. In the end, medieval rumours did not merely ruin lives. They taught people how to live in a world where ruin felt acceptable, where belief outweighed truth, and where the loss of innocence was not a warning sign, but a price quietly, repeatedly paid. Even at the furthest edges of this history, where records thin and voices vanish entirely, the consequences of rumour remain legible in what medieval societies failed to become. Innovation slowed where suspicion ruled, curiosity narrowed where deviation invited danger, and moral growth stagnated where questioning, consensus carried risk. Rumour did not merely destroy individuals. It quietly limited the future by constraining imagination itself, teaching people to fear the unknown rather than explore it, to defend inherited explanations rather than test them. In such an atmosphere, progress was often accidental rather than intentional, emerging despite social structures rather than because of them, as caution outweighed creativity and safety outweighed truth. The constant threat of misinterpretation meant that ideas, like people, had to appear familiar to survive, and unfamiliarity itself became suspect. This created a world that prized repetition over discovery, reinforcing the authority of the past, even when the past was built on error. Rumour thus acted as a brake on transformation, preserving stability at the cost of possibility. And the innocent lives it ruined were often those closest to change. Those who lived differently, thought differently, or simply existed outside the narrow definitions of acceptability. Their elimination was not random. It was structurally convenient, removing friction from a system that depended on sameness to function. Over time, this convenience hardened into necessity, and necessity into moral justification, completing the transformation of fear into virtue. What is most haunting is how rarely this process required explicit cruelty. It unfolded through habits, assumptions, and unspoken agreements, making it difficult even for participants to recognize their own role. People did not wake each day intending harm, yet harm accumulated relentlessly, carried forward by choices that felt small, reasonable, and justified in isolation. The distance between intention and outcome grew so wide that responsibility seemed to dissolve entirely, leaving no one to blame and no one to answer for the damage done. This diffusion of responsibility ensured that injustice could persist indefinitely, because without ownership there could be no correction. The medieval world thus teaches a sobering lesson about the nature of harm, that systems built on fear do not require villains to function, only compliance. And compliance is far easier to secure than cruelty. The innocent lives ruined by rumour were casualties of this ease, erased not by extraordinary evil, but by ordinary accommodation. Their loss reminds us that the greatest danger is not ignorance alone, but the comfort found in unexamined belief, because when belief becomes habit and habit becomes structure, even truth struggles to survive. And with that realization comes the final, quiet horror of medieval rumour culture, that it taught people to confuse endurance with virtue, to mistake the ability to survive within an unjust system for evidence that the system itself was just. Communities endured, kingdoms persisted, faith continued, and this continuity masked the harm done along the way, allowing people to point to survival as proof that their choices had been correct. Yet survival achieved through sacrifice is not vindication. It is simply persistence, and persistence can coexist with profound moral failure. Rumour thrived in this misunderstanding, because as long as society did not visibly collapse, there was little incentive to question the stories that held it together. Those who suffered disappeared quietly, their absence absorbed, their contributions forgotten, their potential unrealized, leaving behind a world slightly poorer, narrower, and more fearful. When all these layers are considered together, the destruction caused by medieval rumours appears less like a series of tragic accidents and more like a deeply embedded social mechanism, one that converted anxiety into action and uncertainty into punishment with relentless efficiency. Rumour filled the gaps left by limited knowledge, weak institutions, and overwhelming fear. But instead of remaining provisional explanations, these stories hardened into moral verdicts, closing off the possibility of correction. Once fixed, they shaped how people interpreted every new event, ensuring that future misfortunes reinforced old suspicions rather than challenged them. A bad harvest confirmed the presence of sinners. An illness proved hidden malice. A disagreement revealed secret hostility, creating a world in which nothing was neutral and everything demanded interpretation through fear. This constant demand for meaning exhausted empathy, because compassion requires patience and ambiguity, while rumour thrived on urgency and certainty. Over time, people learned to conserve emotional energy by aligning with dominant narratives, even when those narratives destroyed lives, because resistance demanded courage without guarantee of success. The structure of medieval life offered few safe spaces for dissent. Authority was concentrated, literacy was rare, and communication travelled slowly, allowing falsehoods to persist unchallenged long enough to become tradition. Once tradition absorbed rumour, it gained moral weight, transforming acts of violence into acts of preservation, and turning punishment into proof of righteousness. This inversion of morality was perhaps the most profound harm of all, because it taught societies to mistake cruelty for care and exclusion, for protection. The innocent lives lost under these systems were not simply misjudged. They were repurposed. Their suffering used to reinforce lessons about obedience, fear, and conformity, ensuring that others would learn how to survive by avoiding difference. Even grief was regulated, as public mourning for the accused could itself arouse suspicion, forcing sorrow into silence and preventing collective reckoning. Without reckoning, there could be no healing, only repetition. And so cycles of accusation resurfaced whenever conditions aligned: scarcity, disease, political instability, each time drawing from the same reservoir of fear and inherited belief. The medieval world thus became a place where the past constantly haunted the present, not through wisdom learned, but through trauma unprocessed, passed down as instinct rather than memory. Rumour thrived in this inheritance because it did not need to persuade. It merely needed to resonate with what people already feared. In such a world, innocence was fragile, not because it was rare, but because it lacked narrative power, offering no explanation for suffering and no promise of control. The true lesson carried by these ruined lives is that societies are most dangerous when they value certainty over compassion and cohesion over justice, because under those conditions, truth becomes negotiable, empathy becomes expendable, and rumour becomes law. At the very end of this long chain of belief and destruction lies a silence more powerful than any accusation, the silence of those who were erased so completely that even doubt could not reach them in time. Medieval rumour did not merely end lives. It denied them narrative closure, leaving no space for rehabilitation, apology, or remembrance, because acknowledging error would have threatened the foundations on which authority, faith, and communal identity rested. To admit that innocent people had been destroyed would have required confronting the terrifying possibility that suffering had no moral cause, that disaster was not always punishment, and that the world could be unjust without reason. Rather than face this uncertainty, societies chose repetition, allowing rumour to continue its work, because it preserved meaning, however false, in a universe that otherwise felt uncontrollable. This choice shaped the emotional architecture of medieval life, teaching people to accept fear as guidance and belief as proof, until these habits became instinctive, passed down not through instruction but through imitation. People learned when to speak, when to remain silent, whom to avoid, and whom to fear, absorbing these lessons so early and so thoroughly that they felt natural, even righteous. In this way, rumour became invisible, no longer recognized as rumour at all, but as reality itself, embedded in law, ritual, and memory. The lives ruined by it became shadows supporting the visible structure of society, their absence normalized, their suffering uncounted, their innocence irrelevant. What history reveals through these patterns is not a distant barbarism, but a warning written in human behaviour, that when fear is rewarded, truth is endangered, when conformity is safer than compassion, injustice multiplies, and when belief replaces inquiry, innocence loses its power to protect. Medieval rumours ruined innocent lives, not because truth was unknown, but because it was inconvenient, and in choosing convenience over conscience, societies learned to live with cruelty as if it were order. The weight of that choice echoes long after the accusations fade, reminding us that the most lasting damage of rumour is not the destruction it causes in the moment, but the moral erosion it leaves behind, quietly shaping how people think, feel, and decide, until the line between survival and cruelty becomes indistinguishable, even after the echoes of those accusations faded into legend. The habits they created continued to govern how people responded to fear, teaching generations that the safest response to uncertainty was not curiosity but suspicion, not patience but punishment. This inheritance meant that medieval rumour culture did not end with a single century or crisis. It resurfaced whenever pressure mounted, because the mental pathways had already been carved. When famine returned, when disease reappeared, when authority wavered, the same reflexes activated, drawing once more on inherited stories of hidden enemies and secret guilt. In this way, rumour became a kind of emotional technology, a tool refined through repeated use, capable of rapidly mobilizing collective action without the slow work of verification or empathy. Its efficiency lay in its brutality, because it offered immediate resolution to fear, even if that resolution was false. People felt safer once someone had been punished, regardless of whether the punishment addressed the true cause of their suffering. And this feeling reinforced the belief that accusation worked. Over time, this logic reshaped the relationship between power and truth, allowing those in authority to rely on rumour as a governing instrument, whether deliberately or passively, because it redirected anger away from structures and toward individuals, preserving systems while sacrificing people. Those who benefited from this arrangement rarely questioned it, because stability, even built on injustice, felt preferable to the chaos of self-examination. The cost of this avoidance was carried by the voiceless, whose lives were reduced to warnings, whose deaths were folded into narratives of necessity, and whose absence became part of the background of daily life. The medieval world thus functioned not despite these ruined lives, but through them, using their suffering as proof that order was being maintained. This realization forces an uncomfortable reckoning, because it reveals how easily societies can normalize harm when it serves emotional or structural needs. The innocent were not destroyed because they were guilty, but because they were convenient. And once convenience becomes a moral standard, injustice requires no further justification. The long shadow of medieval rumour teaches that the most dangerous lies are not those that shock, but those that soothe, that reassure people they understand the world and have done what was necessary, because such lies invite repetition, not correction. And so the lives ruined by these rumours remain a silent testimony, warning that whenever fear is allowed to define truth and belonging is valued above humanity, history is not merely remembered, it is rehearsed. And still the pattern held, repeating itself so smoothly that it rarely felt like repetition at all, because each new crisis arrived wearing different clothes, carrying new names and faces, while relying on the same underlying logic that had already proven itself effective at channeling fear into blame. The machinery of rumour did not require coordination or planning. It operated instinctively, activated by anxiety and sustained by collective participation, making it resilient against reform and resistant to remorse. Even when individuals sensed that something was wrong, that an accusation felt excessive or unjust, the momentum of shared belief carried events forward, leaving little room for intervention, because stopping the process demanded not only moral clarity, but social courage, and courage was punished more consistently than cruelty. Over time, people learned that survival depended on anticipating rumour rather than resisting it, on aligning oneself early with dominant narratives rather than waiting for evidence. And this anticipation shaped behaviour long before accusations ever surfaced. People avoided certain friendships, muted disagreements, concealed differences, and performed conformity as a form of insurance, narrowing their lives to fit within what rumour would not notice. This quiet self-erasure rarely appears in historical records, yet it represents one of the most pervasive harms inflicted by rumour culture, because it limited human possibility even when violence was absent. Lives were shaped around fear of what might be said, not around what might be true.